Hello, Lake Orion. Welcome to History Now here on ONTV. I'm your host, Anthony Taormina. Well, this week I want to talk about is the Napoleonic Wars. For those of you guys who watched the last show, we talked about the French Revolutionary Wars, which, as I said, that could be seen as a change as a time from 1793 to 1801. Now we're going to talk about the Napoleonic Wars, which took place from 1803 to 1815. At this point in Europe, if we can get a map of Europe, from in the 1800s, 1803, France was in control of the Netherlands. They were in control of Italy. Spain had become an ally. Portugal and Britain and Portugal were allied based upon their treaty that they have that still exists today. Also Russia, and then you see other countries like in Poland. It's not exactly Poland at that time, but you see there's changes on the map. Denmark was considered another ally of France at that time. Sweden, and then Russia controlled Finland at that time as well. But by 1803, Britain and France again went to war in Europe. And by 1804, Napoleon Bonaparte, this is his face right here, Napoleon Bonaparte, who was the war hero in France, who was seen as the war hero, he ends up becoming Emperor of France in 1804. He establishes a concordiat with the Vatican at that time during the French Revolution. The French were not getting along with the Vatican until the concordiat with them in 1804. So Napoleon becomes emperor with the Catholic blessing. In 1799, they overthrow the Directory in a coup. There was a coup d'etat that took place. And Napoleon ends up taking power. And then he ends up fighting Austria again. He ends up fighting Prussia again. He ends up fighting Russia again. And he ends up fighting Britain again. But the main coalition partners at this time was Britain, Austria, and Prussia. So in 1805, there was two major battles. There was the Battle of Austerlitz against both Austria and Russia. The French were very successful. Napoleon was able to drive them back. But the French also had a naval setback in the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805, which the combined French and British fleet were going to invade England. Napoleon had long wanted to invade England and wanted to invade London. So he sent a French-Spanish armada into the Atlantic, but also through the English Channel. The British were very successful there in repelling the French-Spanish invasion. And as a result, the French and the Spanish never threatened again in the seas because Napoleon wanted to test the British Navy and was not successful. So then also in 1805, there was the Battle of Jena and Austerlitz, in which Napoleon also defeats Prussia. As a result, Napoleon ends up occupying both Austria and Prussia. Napoleon enlists a continental blockade against Britain, hoping to prevent trade with the British. The British were not allowed to trade with the continent. Britain also goes to war with Denmark. And also Napoleon even establishes a relationship with Alexander I of Russia, in which the Treaty of Tilsit, it takes Russia out of the war. It gives Russia peace. And as a result, Napoleon ended up in control of present-day Germany, present-day Poland, which he renames these territories. One of them he renames the Confederation of the Rhine. There was the Holy Roman Empire at the time, which was seen as the sick man which was seen as the sick man of Europe at that time before the Ottoman Empire took it. The Holy Roman Empire was, Napoleon dissolved that at that point. He had taken it down in 1804, and it was no longer being called the Holy Roman Empire. And as a result, the Holy Roman Empire disbands, and there's several smaller German states that come about as a result of the breakup of the Holy Roman Empire. So Austria, Prussia are defeated. Russia is handled with. There's a continental blockade against Britain. So it seems like Napoleon's on the top of his game right now. He would be in 1810, but there's a couple of events that take down Napoleon. But we're going to talk about that on the second segment of History Now here on ONTV.
We own a Habitat home.
I love working on my Habitat home.
Soy dueño de una casa de Habitat.
My neighbor is a Habitat homeowner.
Being a Habitat homeowner has changed our lives.
My mortgage payment for Habitat is less than what I pay for rent.
Habitat for Humanity of Oakland County currently has homes available with mortgage payments lower than most rent payments. If you or someone you know needs decent and affordable housing, call 248-338-1843 or visit our website at habitatoakland.org.
Welcome back to History Now here on ONTV. I want to save this part of the segment because we're now in by 1807. Now we're heading to 1808, which Napoleon decides he wants to invade Portugal. As I talked about earlier, this alliance goes back from 1713. The alliance between Britain and Portugal, in which the British would repel the Spanish from the Portuguese territory. Napoleon wanted to invade Portugal. So Napoleon ended up wanting to go through Spain to invade Portugal. Napoleon would be successful in invading Portugal, but he did not like the Spanish throne. He did not like the Spanish government either. So Napoleon invaded Spain as well in 1808. Napoleon ended up having a conference with the King of Spain and his son. They detested each other, the king and the son. So as a result, the son, who was the next heir to the throne, handed power back to his dad, who gave power to Napoleon. Napoleon, as a result, gave the throne to his brother Joseph, who at that time was the king of Naples. So Joseph was ending up becoming the illegitimate king of Spain. And many Spanish ended up rebelling against the French, especially in Madrid. And this would be a whole different kind of war in Spain. It became, the Spanish, but also the Portuguese installed guerrilla war tactics. Guerrilla warfare was not seen in Europe at this time until 1808, in which the Spanish and the Portuguese used it to succession against the French. That they would use like buildings or places and smaller forces, and would cause havoc to the French regular troops. As a result, it would be a brutal campaign in which many Frenchmen, Spanish, and Portuguese were killed. Now, the British intervened because the British had an alliance with Portugal, and they had, led by the Duke of Wellington, Sir Arthur Weasley. He was a British commander that wanted to help his country, Britain, in many ways it could, and was ordered with a limited amount of British troops to fight in the peninsula, in the Iberian Peninsula. So as a result, Britain was able to drive the French out of Portugal, and then also with the fighting in Spain, the Spanish eventually drove the French out of Spain. This enraged Napoleon. So in 1809, 1810, Napoleon went back into Spain, occupied Portugal as well. And once again, the British, with the support of the Portuguese and the Spanish to some extent, because the Spanish weren't fully allied with the British, and they weren't fully supportive they were distrustful of the British, and the British were distrustful of the Spanish. So there was not as much coordination between the two countries as you would think there would be. So, but this would drain French troops of much needed troops, and also it gave Austria another opportunity to say, we can take down the French again. The French are in a weakened state. Let's see if we can take advantage of the French fighting in Spain. Well, Napoleon saw this happen. So the French were ending up being forced to fight briefly in two fronts. They had the Battle of Wagram, in which the French manhandled the Austrians. Napoleon ended up taking down the Austrians again, but during that time too, he was having friction with the Pope Pius. So he occupied the Vatican, which Napoleon saw saw as a papal state, or as an occupying force against them. So the Pope excommunicated Napoleon. Now, Napoleon obviously would divorce his wife Josephine from his personal life. He wanted to marry the daughter of Alexander. Also, but he ended up settling for marrying Austrian Marie Louise instead. But this event would force war with Russia in the violation of the Treaty of Tilsit. So Napoleon has to send troops into Russia. Now, this creates a problem with Napoleon because, as we've talked about with World War II, you're fighting a war on two fronts, and also so you fear your troops would be overextended. So the Spanish War was taking down Napoleon with British support, but also Napoleon was putting in massive amounts of energy to fighting in Russia. Now, Napoleon takes Russia. He takes Moscow. Well, he doesn't take all of Russia because Russia's so big, but he takes Moscow. But Alexander encourages a scorched earth policy, so buildings were burned, food was scarce, you had the harsh Russian winter coming in. Boy, this sounds familiar, doesn't it? As far as if you learn your World War II history, this sounds familiar. So Napoleon is left without food, without shelter. His soldiers are suffering in the cold, so they began a long, harsh retreat back away from Russia and heading back home into Paris. But at that time, and we're going to go over this in the third segment, this encourages Prussia and Austria and other European powers to again unite against France. So we're going to talk about, this leads into the Battle of the Nations in Leipzig, which is in the former Holy Roman Empire. But we're going to discuss that here on History Now on ONTV. Hello, Lake Orion and Oakland County. This is Anthony Taormina here, talking a new show here called OA Now. We're going to talk about sports from football to basketball to volleyball to track and field to soccer, cross country, etc. here on OA Now on ONTV. Welcome back to History Now here on ONTV. At this point now, we're in 1812. Napoleon is retreating from Russia. Also, Britain with support of Spain and Portugal, are entering France from its western border. Also, you have Russia now Advancing west, you have Austria and Prussia uniting with the Russians, fighting against the French. The French are losing troops. This leads to the Battle of the Nations in Leipzig, where the combined armies of Britain, Russia, Austria, and Prussia are taking down Napoleon and his army in Leipzig. It allows the occupation of France to take place. Napoleon is forced to abdicate in 1814. He's sent on an island off of the coast of France. But Napoleon, however, returns from abdication in 1815, the 100 Days. So Napoleon comes back. At this point, they have Louis XVIII, France does, back in power. France was a constitutional monarchy. Napoleon he wanted to regain the initiative back in France. He did not want France to go back to a monarchy. As a result of the Battle of the Nations, Napoleon, and as I said, Napoleon abdicates. The armies of Britain, Austria, Prussia, and Russia all unify to take down the French army. The French army is all but defeated. They allow Napoleon to keep a small force. So Napoleon ends up abdicating, but then he comes back into the picture, retakes France for about 100 days. This alarms the other countries, particularly Britain, Austria, Prussia, and Russia. And they end up having another fight, this time at the Battle of Waterloo, which is seen as one of the major battles of the war. Napoleon ends up being exiled again to Sardinia, and as a result, there was the Conference of Vienna, which takes place in 1814, even though the 100 days, this happens right after the conference, or this happens right before Waterloo, the Conference of Vienna, which reshapes Europe. The organizers of this event was Austria, Prussia, and Russia, because they were on the continent. Britain was seen as an observer. Now, France also got some territory in this as well. They were seen as a dominant power as well, again, because of Louis XVIII and what was happening in France, making sure that France would be represented well at the table. But the main power brokers, and this would be this way until World War I, was Austria, Prussia, which would eventually unify into Germany, them and Austria would fight to who would be the unifiers of Germany, which ended up being Prussia. So it would be Austria, Prussia, which would eventually become Germany, and then Russia, because they were on the continent. But also France would get some representation on the table. Also, you've got Britain, which was an island. So Britain did not intervene as much on continental Europe affairs. Spain and Portugal, however, were seen as declining powers. So they weren't given as much power and influence over in the Conference of Vienna table. Also, we eventually will see Sardinia play a major role in Europe, because Sardinia is eventually the country that is responsible for the unification of Italy. But this conference in 1814, the Vienna Conference, would be the peace in Europe until World War I, which would begin in 1914. So this lasted for almost 100 years, this peace. But it did not allow for any radicalization in France. Now, France will become an empire again in 1840 under Napoleon II, which the ironies of that. Napoleon II would take power, and France would again engage war, not in Europe, though, but in other areas, particularly in Mexico. And also, you've got France wanting to, France will end up still becoming a world power, but their influence, but France ends up going through changes after changes in government And the thing about France is unique. France is unique. And there was this alliance system that would take place following the Conference of Vienna. But without the Napoleonic Wars, without the French Revolutionary Wars, Europe would not be what it is today. It was France's attempt to go against Europe, and France did succeed for a time. There was a time, 1810, Napoleon was at the height of his power, and France was seen as the focal point in European affairs. And in many ways, and argumentally, even though people will say Berlin, Paris was also seen as a centerpiece of Europe during that time. There was a lot of fighting going on. There was this experiment at democracy in France. Now, France is a republic today. There is a republic in France, but France experimented with this, and it went from a divine right monarchy, constitutional monarchy, republic, dictatorship, then the directory, then empire, then back to a constitutional monarchy. And then it would eventually between a republic and a monarchy until today, present day, 1940 until 1940, and then it became a democracy, it's a democracy, or it's still a republic today, France is. But this doesn't happen without the French Revolution and the French Revolutionary Wars and the subsequent Napoleonic Wars. Are they linked? I think that both the French Revolutionary Wars and the Napoleonic Wars were linked, just like World War I and World War II were. But, this spells it for this week's episode of History Now here on ONTV. You have any other history questions, just email me on my Twitter page @AntTrain. Thank you. Have a great night, and see you Lake Orion.